Okay. So it says live, it looks like we're here. So my name's Linda, and I want to welcome everybody to the third session of our 6-week OLLI course. Today's talk will provide us with a glimpse into the world of Today's talk will provide us with a glimpse into the world of cryptocurrencies and something I'm absolutely have never heard of, fintech. Our presenter today is Geoffrey Woglam. He has a Ph.D. from Yale University and is currently affiliated with Amherst College. So I'm going to let you take it over.
Thank you very much, Linda. So let's see if I can get this screen shared. And Linda, does that look good? Can you see it?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Okay, so you've had a couple of sessions, I think, already. So I'm gonna, I hope, go through this fairly quickly about need. I hope that the previous speakers have mentioned that we speak to lots of different groups, not just OLLIs, so that if you had an interest in getting a talk on one of these topics, you would contact Jon Haveman. So you had an economic update with Jon. You're getting and trade with Alan Deerdorf. That must have been good. Cryptocurrencies with me, and then the following two are federal debt, economic inequality, and trade deficits. So let me, if there are only potentially what we're talking about, there's 4 or 5 people who could ask questions. Raise your hand, or you can put it in the chat, but raise your hand if you know how to do that, and you can stop me. Sometimes I give these talks and people afterwards will say, gee, I loved your talk. It was so interesting. Of course, I didn't understand anything. Well, that's not really a compliment. So I would particularly enjoy if I say something that's really confusing. Raise your hand, ask me to try to explain a little bit more. Some of this stuff is a little bit confusing. And I would rather deal with your questions than have you be confused. I will stay after the talk and we can do a Q&A. The other thing is, there are 2 things at the end. One, there's a glossary of terms. I'm sorry I couldn't get that to you ahead of time. And there's also, as it says on the screen here, the slides will be available. Usually Jon gets them up later in the afternoon, no later than tomorrow. I'm sorry. And then in addition to the glossary at the end, there's some resources if you wanted to learn more and about some of the issues that we're going to talk about. Okay, so here's what we're going to talk about. I like to start with some fun. There's some interesting, crazy stuff about Bitcoin that's just fun to go through. Then the tough part is going through the underlying technology of Bitcoin. But that gets us to me, what's the most important part, which is some key questions that an economist is interested in. First of all, what is the economic role? Is it a legitimate economic role that Bitcoin is serving? Second is, even no matter how you answer number 1, is there potential underneath the technology, using the technology of Bitcoin for financial innovations? So we're going to spend most of our time on those 2 things. But that's going to naturally lead into the idea that we need good regulation in the crypto space, and possibly we may need something called a Fed digital dollar, which I will get to at the very end of the talk. So that's sort of where we're going. But first, what is Bitcoin? And Bitcoin was the first cryptocurrency and was invented in 2008. A cryptocurrency is a digital form of money. It only is data exists on a computer, where the account ownership is confidential and where record keeping is decentralized over a multitude of computers. That's a mouthful. When I say it's digital money, we already have digital money, Venmo, Zelle, credit cards in some sense. But there's something about it where it's more like cash than it is like Venmo, because your identity is somewhat protected in Bitcoin. And then there's this decentralized way in which transactions are cleared. We'll get there. Okay. Most importantly, Bitcoin has the potential to start a revolution in finance. It could affect the way we buy and sell things, our so-called payment system, the way we save, borrow, and invest. The role of banks and other financial firms are all going to be potentially affected by Bitcoin. Here's the bottom line. In my view, Bitcoin itself will not be an important player in the future developments, but the technologies underlying Bitcoin may be. I'm a little bit, I'm not sure about the potential for the underlying technologies, and we'll go into the reasons for that as we go along. Okay, so here's some fun facts. Bitcoin was started in 2008. As you can see, not much was happening. I'm sorry, let me explain the chart first. I'm out of practice, sorry. The orange line is the percentage value increase relative to the starting point, which is in February of 2017. You can see that there's an uptick in 2018, then kind of steady, and then an explosion in 2021, a big dip, another big increase, and most recently, there's been a sharp decline. The blue line is the same chart for gold. And there are a couple of things about comparing the orange line to the blue line. Obviously, Bitcoin, even with the big drop, is still up 2,000% from what it was in February of 2017. So the orange line is much higher than the blue line. But look at how volatile it is. It makes gold look like some sort of stable commodity. Okay, we think of gold. I think of gold as a speculative asset. So to tease Bitcoin a little bit, I'm sorry, because it's so volatile, whenever I give the talk, I have to consult at a specific time of the day what Bitcoin is trading at. It's currently at $25,200 approximately. Excuse me, it was at noon my time today. To poke a little bit of fun, I'm going to call it what was all the excitement about, because obviously if you bought up here, that was something like $60,000. You're not too happy with a price of $25,000. Okay. In addition, Bitcoin is becoming part of the culture. And this is an example of a so-called Bitcoin ATM. It's not an ATM in the traditional sense. It's where you put money in and you can get a Bitcoin. You can buy Bitcoin or sell Bitcoin at this ATM. This happens to be Bitcoin Depot, and I picked that image because I don't know if anyone goes to this ARCO station, but in any event, this happens to be at 1924 West Alondra Boulevard in Compton, which I think is at least close to the university. Does anyone seen this ARCO store? Well, if you go in there, I'm not going to guarantee you that your Bitcoin ATM will look like that, but there will be a Bitcoin Depot ATM in this ARCO station. And it is one of over 50,000 Bitcoin ATMs. Whenever I give the talk, I always pick a local one, and I've never had trouble getting one fairly close to the address of the people I'm talking to. Okay, this is a little bit of an editorial comment that I'm going to sneak in. So this is my opinion, but it's becoming so ubiquitous that we're beginning to see things like the following. This is an ad from Fidelity about adding Bitcoin to your 401k plan. I usually don't give much investment advice. Do not put Bitcoin in your 401k, okay? This is insane. I almost think that Fidelity is failing in their fiduciary responsibilities, because this is much, much too speculative to be part of an investment portfolio. I guess they say, you know, they're going to limit you to up to 20% of the allocation. I think it should be up to 0, but we'll see. Okay. Here's some more facts to give you some idea of the crypto universe. Bitcoin, as I mentioned, was the first, and it is the largest in terms of market cap. That means the total value of all of Bitcoin's outstanding at about $372 billion. That's down a heck of a lot. When I first did this, when it was up at 60,000, that was like 4 trillion. The second place is a cryptocurrency that operates on the Ethereum blockchain. The currency is called Ether, and it has second place with $160 billion in market cap. Ethereum is very important for reasons that we will get to in the course of our conversation. Okay, there are over 11,000 different varieties with a total market cap of about 975 billion. And you can see that half of it is the two biggest ones. Anybody who wants can start their own digital currency. Many of them obviously are not terribly important. Okay, to put 975 billion in context, the market cap of domestically the listed US companies is about 40 trillion. That was as of 2020. I got a little nervous because if you've looked at your 401k, you know the market's down considerably, but we're more or less at the same level that we were in 2020. So that 40 trillion is probably approximately correct. So 975 billion, nowhere near the importance of the stock market, but it's not insignificant. That's a substantial amount of money. Okay. This may be the last fun fact. The origin story reads like a graphic or a pulp novel. There is this mysterious character called Satoshi Nakamoto, who must have some sort of a computer background, and he is fulminating around the time of the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy. And he or she or they has clearly some libertarian impulses and a tremendous distrust of government and financial institutions. So on Halloween, Satoshi publishes a white paper, which is just a paper explaining what he's going to do. And the white paper is about the idea and the design for Bitcoin. The author used Satoshi Nakamoto as a pseudonym. And again, we don't know if it's a he, a she, or a they. Whoops, what happened there? Went backwards. In January of 2009, the first version of the Bitcoin software was published on the internet, was available. So things started trading in January of 2009. From 2009 through 2010, for 2 years, Satoshi is releasing new versions of the software and is actively involved in discussing the virtues and promoting Bitcoin. In April of 2011, Satoshi ceases all known and or verified communications. To this day, nobody knows the identity or identities of Satoshi Nakamoto. That sounds like if you read this in a novel, I'm not sure you would believe it. But in any event, sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. So let's talk about the possible economic role. So now we're going to get a little bit more serious. Well, Satoshi had a vision, and the vision was for a purely peer-to-peer version of electronic cash that would allow online payments to be sent directly from one party to another without going through a financial institution. I hope you see, if you're a libertarian and you don't like government and you don't trust financial institutions, particularly in the light of the financial crisis of 2008, this has some virtue to it. We don't have to have the FDIC or the Fed worried about us. We can just work this out together. Sometimes I describe it as it's Uberizing the payment system. So instead of calling a taxi cab where a guy works for the taxi company and so forth and so on, basically you get two people, one needs a ride, the other guy's got a car, you get them together and it's a peer-to-peer transaction. I know Uber stands behind it, so it's not, that analogy is not perfect. So I'm an economist. I'm a little bit more prosaic, but I want to point out that there's a lot that could be improved in our payment system. In some sense, I don't know whether Bitcoin, I know Bitcoin won't do it, but there's a lot that could be improved. It would be wonderful to facilitate payments at lower cost with speed, and so that's supposed to say security. You may not be familiar with credit card fees, but if you run a business, you are, because the credit card companies take something like 3% from the purchase price that's being, when something's being bought with a credit card. I run into this when I try to pay my property tax bill. I can pay it with a credit card, but then I've got to add 2 or 3% so that the town is not being billed for the credit card fee. In addition, it's not fast. It takes the merchant up to at least 2 days to receive currency, or not currency, but a check. More importantly, cross-border transactions are particularly inefficient, costly, and there are security problems as well. And cross-border transactions were $1.9 trillion in 2018. That's 10% of GDP, to put that number in perspective. There's tremendous improvement that could be made in cross-border international payments. And our payment system is not terribly secure. As one example, in 2019, Capital One hackers accessed the personal information of over 100 million users. The other thing that I think was partially in Satoshi's vision was to meet the needs of the previously unbanked. And this is particularly a problem in the developing world, although they're doing lots of interesting things in the developing world, and maybe in the Q&A I'll give you some examples of that. But even in the United States, we have a problem with the unbanked or the underbanked. These are people, when they need to pay their rent or a utility bill, they're going down to the grocery store and getting a money order. Terribly inefficient, terribly expensive. The Fed estimates that 50 million US adults have little or no banking relationships. A lot could be improved with our payment system. So now let's talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to have to bite the bullet and talk a little bit about the underlying technology. I'm going to start at a very generalized area discussion and then get down into the weeds. There are 3 important aspects of cryptocurrency. The first is what's called a digital token. All a digital token is it's data on a computer. But the ownership of the token is cryptographically protected. It's private, and the cryptographic, it's not just a little password. It's much more intensive protection. The second part is that the transactions are recorded on something called a distributed ledger using blockchain technology. Distributed ledger means the books are available in a lot of different places. The books are kept on computers all over the world. The blockchain technology I'm going to explain in a couple of minutes. The final key piece of information about a cryptocurrency is the software that Satoshi came up with has a protocol that provides what's called a consensus mechanism on the validity of new transactions. So it's the whole network that decides that these transactions are valid, that nobody's trying to spend the Bitcoin twice, okay? There's no third party. Normally, when you write a check, the bank says, we're not going to clear this check if you don't have sufficient funds. If you're trying to, what it's called, kiting a check, kiting checks. So we rely, if we're not using these cryptocurrencies, we're always relying on a trusted third party. Venmo stands between you and the person you're sending the cash to, okay? Satoshi's going to do away with anybody in between. Again, it's peer-to-peer transactions. Okay, so let me give a prosaic example of this. Jack owns a Bitcoin. Jack has a public number. It's called a key. It's really a fancy password, although a very complicated one. I'm sorry, the public number is not complicated. He has a private encrypted key. That's the one that's highly cryptographically protected. Public number that's known, that it shows up on the transactions, and then a private number that only Jack has. Jack can trade his Bitcoins with Jill by using Jill's public key. So he sends a transaction to the network and says, take this Bitcoin and give it to Jill. Jack is able to verify the transaction with his private key. So only somebody with the private key could transfer a Bitcoin, but you transfer it to a public number. The new transaction is then posted on a number of different computers that can be read by anyone. And I want to emphasize that the blockchain is this crazy combination of private and public. Every single transaction is recorded on the blockchain, and you could look at every single one back to 2008, and it's in terms of the public numbers. Okay. What you don't know is who's behind those public numbers, because then you would need to know the private number. We can talk about why the feds have been able to get at some of the people who use the Bitcoin for nefarious purposes. But before we do, the clearing of the transaction is done with this distributed ledger called a blockchain. For Bitcoin, it's done through a process called Bitcoin mining. I'm going to talk about a second process, but to begin, we're just going to look at the Bitcoin miners. The miners, I'll tell you why. Miners is kind of a funny name, but we'll get to that in a second. The Bitcoin miners gather about 3,000 of the new transactions in a block. This is just a way of describing the 3,000 transactions. The next step is to provide a decentralized mechanism to add a new block to the blockchain. And the blockchain is all the previous blocks of transactions that have been added, and an agreement that all the transactions are valid. So now we're going to look at how Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining does that. By the way, it's called proof of work. The miners get involved in a competition. The competition involves generating long random numbers. It's called hashing, if you ever read about this, until one of the numbers that's generated by one of the computers fits a very, very precise set of attributes. To show you how complicated it is, miners produce on the order of 200 million trillion random numbers per second. So by the way, you could, on your Macintosh computer, you could get the software for Bitcoin and you could try to mine Bitcoin, but what are the chances that you're going to generate the right random number before these supercomputers are doing it? The answer is none. The winning miner, the one miner who eventually gets the right random number, adds the new block to the previous blocks in the blockchain, and that process takes about 10 minutes. The incentive for the miners is that the winner of the competition gets compensated with new Bitcoins, newly created Bitcoins, and transactions fees. Here is how the consensus occurs. The miner doesn't get the reward unless other miners subsequently add new blocks to the first miner's block. So if you see that a transaction is not valid and it's been added to the blockchain, if you're a miner, you're not going to add to that block. You're going to say, nope, I'm going to go back to the previous one and add it to that because the transaction's not valid. And what that does is it gets a consensus. Everybody agrees this is a valid transaction. And it's done without a trusted third party or referee deciding on what is valid and what's not. Okay, This is an example of a Bitcoin mine. And it's just one corridor. Probably there are about 10 of these corridors. Here are the supercomputers. On the left, here's some electrical stuff. On the right, I'm not sure how these things work, but it's to give you an idea of the scale involved in this proof of work in recording transactions. So if I'm not seeing any questions, so I'm going to keep going, but remember, if you need some help, please stop me. Question number one, Bitcoin is not and cannot be widely used to make transactions. Why not? Well, one of the major issues is called scalability. To give you a sense of scalability, let's look at competing payments mechanisms. And this chart is showing you how many transactions per second are processed by Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, and then 3 cryptocurrencies. The jagged line means that the bar is literally off the chart, okay? Visa does the most with 3,526 transactions per second, followed by MasterCard over 2,000. Even PayPal is 241 transactions per second. Here's Bitcoin, 3.3. How are you going to scale 3.3 up to 3,000 per second? It's just not possible. Particularly, I'm sorry, another problem with Bitcoin, it's not particularly, another problem with Bitcoin is the price is unstable. Not just in the chart I've shown you, but during the day, it can fluctuate 10 or 15, 20, 30%. So it's kind of like you go into Starbucks to buy a latte. If you pay with Bitcoin, you may end up paying $8 for your latte, in which case you're not happy. Or you may end up paying $3, the equivalent of $3 for the transaction, in which case Starbucks is not happy. More importantly, the fact that the price is so unstable means that there's a lot of uncertainty in using Bitcoin to make a transaction. Uncertainty discourages people from making transactions with Bitcoin. So the instability, the price instability means that it's not going to become widely accepted to buy lattes with. Transactions cost, they are not trivial. I've forgotten exactly what they are, but it's not 3% of a $4 latte. It's more like hundreds of dollars. And the network itself is costly. I'm imagining that most of you have heard about it. I will give you some statistics. Bitcoin mining currently requires 150 to 200 terawatt hours per year. That's more than Thailand with a carbon footprint of the Czech Republic. The environmental cost of this is just unbelievable. In addition, Jon Haveman sent me an article from The Economist this morning where it's pointing out that, guess what? All those supercomputers have computer chips in them. They are computer chips that are designed to do one thing, generate those random numbers. In other words, you can't plug it into your Mac. All it's going to do is generate those random numbers. Apparently, a lot of the chip shortage is due to the fact that a lot of the chips are going to Bitcoin miners. Okay. So the resources used, the environmental costs, it's a non-starter. However, something really, really exciting happened in September. Ethereum, the second oldest, the second biggest blockchain, and we're using the Ether currency, adopted a different way of reaching a consensus called proof of stake. And I see if you can figure out why this is going to be a lot better. Before I get to proof of stake, who owns the network? Nobody. He published, I should have found, who asked that question? I'm sorry. I know I should have addressed, but Linda, that's what's so fantastic. Nobody owns it, okay? The protocol is the protocol. You can change the protocol if there's a majority of people who are Bitcoin miners who agree to it, but nobody owns the network. So who pays for it? Well, the way that the miners are being compensated is with new Bitcoin and transactions fees. So the people who are trading on the network are paying for it, and then the network itself is creating new Bitcoins. Satoshi, this is a detail that's not terribly important, but he decided that there would be a limit in terms of the total number of Bitcoins available. And periodically, the reward for adding a new block is halved in terms of the Bitcoins. And at something like 2032, there will be no more Bitcoins created, but then it will be total. The network, the miners will be compensated totally with transactions fees from the people making the transaction. Okay, so let's look at this, I think, fairly exciting innovation. So a miner is a potential block creator in the Bitcoin world. In the Ethereum world, they're called validators. So a validator in order to become a validator, you have to pledge Ether, which is the currency used on the Ethereum blockchain, in specialized wallets that are locked.